Quote from the book on Invention on Demand. Patent-protected suppliers pose a particularly difficult challenge to procurement. The Invention on Demand strategy, which is based on TRIZ, an expression that stands for the theory of inventive problem-solving, systematically develops alternative technical solutions pulling ideas from scientific sources. Okay, out of the 64, this one is by far my favorite method in the purchasing chessboard. It is not one that you will use frequently, and you may be lucky not to have a single category in the upper left corner of the chessboard. But most companies are exposed to some patent-protected and monopolistic suppliers. In the past, when I started as a procurement consultant, we labeled this as non-addressable spend and moved on. And this bugged me. How can something that a company buys and spends money on be non-addressable? Well, and then through a lucky coincidence, I came across TRIZ, and this changed everything. In this video, I will tell you about my journey here, and since most of this happened 20 years ago, I will share more details than usually. Let's get started. About 20 years ago, I did my first project outside the automotive industry. It was for a maker of domestic boilers with a revenue of about $1.5 billion. While a lot of logic and terminology was similar to that of car makers, one aspect struck me: speed of decision making. In my prior projects with car makers, we delivered elaborate reports, but if I'm honest, I don't recall seeing any immediate impact. At the boiler maker, I would talk to executives in the morning, and in the afternoon, something would have changed on the ground. This got me thinking, boy, what I'm saying has real consequences, so I better make sure that my advice is sound. Anyway, one of the projects we ran at the boiler maker was a cost down in procurement. And the savings from this cost down were expected to fund a major portion of an acquisition the boiler maker was digesting at that point in time. And while we were going through the categories, one popped up under non-addressable spend. I don't want this to become a lecture on boilers, but I believe I need to give you some context so you can better understand. In a gas-fueled boiler, a flame heats water that flows through a heat exchanger. Traditionally, this heat exchanger is made of copper. Copper is relatively easy to work with and therefore is a preferred material for plumbers. It also conducts heat really well. But copper has one problem. When exposed to acids, it corrodes really quickly. Now you may believe that burning natural gas just produces water vapor and CO2. Well, unfortunately, natural gas contains a certain portion of sulfur as well. And if you burn sulfur, you get a mixture of SO2 and SO3. Combining this with water gives you a pretty strong acid. For this very reason, traditional boilers are calibrated in a way that the temperature of the exhaust gas passing the heat exchanger never drops below the boiling temperature of water. Failing to ensure this, the water vapor would condensate on the surface of the heat exchanger and together with the SO2 and SO3 would form acid. Now, if you remember science class from school, the condensation of water releases quite a lot of energy. So in an ideal world, you would like to harvest this energy in the boiler. And this is where a condensing heat exchanger comes in. How does that heat exchanger cope with acid, you may ask? By using stainless steel instead of copper. And for other reasons, it usually looks like a drum with a coil inside rather than a radiator. Now, while the general principle is pretty straightforward, high efficiency of boilers was not a priority until it was, triggered by new legislation. But what everyone in the industry had overlooked is that one Italian supplier had invested heavily in that market and developed the winning design of a condensing heat exchanger. Not only were they the only one with an offering, they had it patent protected. On the customer market, this had the effect that all boilers came with the same heat exchanger. In the automotive world, this would be like all car makers using exactly the same engine. And yes, there are people who are excited about boilers, and we call them installers. On the procurement side, this obviously meant that we were dealing with a monopolistic supplier who saw zero incentive to contribute anything to the savings target. And this is where my mentor, Nico Söllner, came into the game. He had been contacted by a team of scientists from the former Soviet Union, and they claimed to have an approach to reliably bypass patents, not break patents, but to come up with novel concepts that don't infringe upon the patent. And now we are back to speedy decision making. I shared this with the executives of the Boilermaker, and within a couple of days we had agreement to do this. Okay, let's talk about the approach. TRIZ was developed by an engineer called Genrich Altschuler in the 1950s when he was stationed in Baku in Azerbaijan. He already held a couple of patents when he asked himself a key question. Is inventing something random where you have to wait for a spark of genius? Or is it actually a process that can be described, taught and learned? His firm belief was the latter, and he started to perform research that was increasingly supported by the Red Army. In the end, his team had analyzed 200,000 patents from all over the world, and they had a couple of key insights. The first one was that inventive patents typically are triggered by contradiction, like I want a faster airplane. But when I put more powerful engines, these engines are heavier and require a stronger and therefore heavier airframe that in turn makes the aircraft slower. So the contradiction would be, how can I make the aircraft faster without making it heavier? Then Altschuler found that very often the inspiration for a patent did not come from the immediate field of engineering or science, but from an adjacent or an entirely different field. So very often the best solution for an hydraulic problem is not hydraulic, but for example electrical. This poses the problem of cross-functional or cross-discipline thinking, something that companies are not exactly famous for. Altschuler and his disciples published a lot, but his most groundbreaking work are probably the 40 inventive principles. These are very hands-on and pretty intuitive ways to think about a problem. Let's take a look at a couple of examples. Principle 28, mechanic substitution, a truly genius one in which Altschuler kind of predicted a lot of what is happening with sensors and smart devices today. Principle 31, porous materials. Here we have a super prominent implication with aerogels that are extremely light while providing excellent insulation against heat. Principle 37, thermal expansion, where you make use of the different degrees of thermal expansion or contraction of different materials. A practical application would be removing the metal lid of a glass bottle by heating the lid. And I really encourage you to read more about TRIZ, and there are several books on Amazon. Anyway, so we have a team of TRIZ experts working with a team of engineers from the Boilermaker. And after 2 months, they completely dissect the patent of the heat exchanger. What they did in essence is take each and every claim of the patent, run it through the TRIZ approach, and in effect turn it against the patent. Before, the patent looked like an impenetrable wall. After applying TRIZ, it looked like a Swiss cheese mostly made of holes. And many of these holes looked a lot more competent, efficient, effective and cheaper than the patent. Okay, and then came the big renegotiation. It was a pretty straightforward affair. The Boilermaker invited the key people of the monopolistic supplier, and they presented the TRIZ approach and the Swiss cheese. And they concluded with the following statement. You know, we really didn't want to do this, but now we have all these compelling concepts for a condensing heat exchanger that don't infringe on your patent. What should we do with those? We could industrialize them, but this would feel like a distraction from our core business. Or we could provide the concepts to one of your competitors. Just tell us what to do. As you may imagine, this was a short negotiation that resulted in the supplier making major concessions. So there you have it, A8 Invention on Demand, a purchasing chessboard method that all but eliminates the term non-addressable spend. Okay, I'm curious, have you known about TRIZ before and have you already applied it? Let all of us know in the comments down below. And should you have a question, I will get back to you within 24 hours. Thank you for watching and I see you in the next one. Bye.